Ask any marketer today, and they'll tell you brand and performance are opposites, but in practice, they often live in different spreadsheets, managed by different teams and with different goals. Today, we're sitting down with two experts to discuss the often misunderstood and very complicated relationship between brand and performance. Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a podcast by Precis. Every month, we explore trends and changes in the world of marketing with practical insights and expert perspectives. If you're a marketer, this podcast is for you. Joining me today is Cedric, CMO of Ellos. Cedric brings an incredible experience both from the agency and the brand side, and he now leads the marketing team at Ellos. Ellos started in 1947 as an on-mail catalog business and is now one of the most famous e-commerce businesses in the Nordics. With me, also Dag. Dag is a client director and partner at Precis in Copenhagen. He has been with Precis with over a decade, helping both B2B and B2C brands navigate in the complex modern marketing landscape. Then let's get it started. Well, Cedric, when we discussed the topic before, you told me something that really stayed with me. And that was that, branding has been marketing for many, many centuries. And then was just some decades ago that we started talking about brand and performance, and the two became something different. But in truth, they are the same thing. They shouldn't be separate. Do you think we actually got smarter marketers because of this, or do you think we're a little bit short term?
I think the answer rely on so many different aspects in terms of the evolutions. One of the things that really truly impact the market and the consumer is we never seen such a lower interest rate. So in terms of performance, it was always easy to grasp any growth aspect and at any cost of sales where the company had that goal. So I think the shift becomes, why buying from this brand than the other brands?
Okay. And Doug, do you think we talked a little bit about last time, what is performance? And the fact that not everything that can be measured is performance and not everything that is performance can be measured. What's your take on it?
I think that's the core of many of the perhaps not only frustrating, hopefully also encouraging conversations that brands will be having around this balance between brand and performance, is because we have this luxury situation essentially that is that you can get a number for anything. You can get a number of impressions, or you can get a number of associated sales, or your return on investment, cost of sale, what have you. Where I think that has become a bit of a problem, also referring to the economic history that you mentioned now, Cedric, is that when everything goes well and performance just skyrockets, it's easy to think that it's because it's performance marketing that it did well. And then introducing the idea of investing in brand is something that seems, unnecessary because you've gotten the good results anyway. Now we're seeing very different macroeconomic climate, and we're seeing brands having to make tough decisions, not only on their marketing investments, also on their staffing and products and export markets and everything else. And that's the situation where having measurable efforts, even if they're not directly comparable, or if brand shouldn't be measured on performance merits, it is being done because it's the easiest way for someone, especially those sitting on the money, to dismiss an investment opportunity in branding that isn't going to give a short-term payback.
Right. But then I'm going to ask you the $500 million questions, which is, what should brand be measured on?
I would love for that to be a classic consultant "it depends" answer. However, I know that's not going to do for a podcast or for today. So I think what I always like to do is just understand the customer journey and the relationship between seeing the brand the first time and engaging with it and buying from it eventually. I would question the customer service department. I would question the founders of the brand if we have access to those. Anyone who has all of those customer anecdotes as to why did you buy, and then use that to derive back from a sale. So saying, all right, we understand, and it takes a certain amount of exposure or certain number of brand introductions before you buy, i.e. we can use that ratio and calculate back from something relatively fixed, such as purchases or newsletter signups or whatever else relatively hard conversion that you can find, but then pulling it back towards the branding efforts and saying, all right, you just extrapolate the need and recognizing that brand is a long-term game. So it might take 10, 15, 20, 25 interactions of some sort up the funnel before you buy, and then you have your ratio of performance evaluation on the brand.
Makes sense. And I think I forgot to ask you both a very important question, which is, what is brand? I mean, it could be so many different things, and in B2B and B2C we have different definitions, but I think each company has a definition internally that is also relevant to the way you actually show the value of brand. So Cedric, how do you define brand at Ellos?
When we come from this legacy of e-commerce and selling product and with a product and a price point, branding becomes something that you want to capture to influence a consumer, to vehicle the messages around the emotions and the value connected to the brand. So at the end of the day, what you want to achieve is to answer the question of why consumers should buy from you versus another competitors or another player. And the branding definition could vary from company to company, but when it comes to strictly e-commerce, then you really need to stick out because there's so many different values that connected to it. And it's not only the product, but it's also the services and what you provide, but in terms of, emotion, feelings of following any trends when it comes to fashion on a home or the fashion itself, but also it's how you vehicle, all the dimensions that are connected with the sustainability behind it. So brand can carry so many different factors in order to, convince and influence the consumer.
When I was doing a little bit of research for the episode, I was also reading about some stats around brand loyalty and how that is changing, especially for like younger generations, so below 30, because apparently 30 is not young anymore. But yeah, it seems like even from a couple of years ago, like what we consider brand loyalty has been decreasing insanely. So I wonder, how do you build brand loyalty when it's so difficult and when consumers are changing their choices so fast?
I think the evolution of the last 20 years, because that's a little bit of like what we can see of, we lift up the point of brand and performance. And the barrier for any players today working really hard on the UX part to unleash any possible obstacles from payment methods, delivery, clarity, transparency, product, prices, descriptions, etc. And all the part that we just came from with the influencers wave was enormous. It means that consumers have the possibility to trust any kind of players today, where it was not necessarily the case. Even 15 years ago, people were reluctant to probably buy from different players, that especially outside of the local market. But today, you don't have those obstacles. And it becomes very difficult because then how do you create that stickiness with the consumer? And it's a learning process. Of course, like we coming from a very heavy background of performance, and now we need to create, again, influencing the decision of like, why should I buy from that brand versus that brand? And what do they carry in terms of value that is today responding to how you're responsible for everything on staff, productions, the sustainability part, but also how you treat your customers and the respect you have behind it of creating all those different aspects. That influences the sales for sure. And it's not only buying the product. You always have part of the market that will only focus on buying the cheapest product. But at the end of the day, that's the only way you can differentiate yourself with another player.
Can you tell us a little bit about any initiatives or how do you do this at Ellos in practice?
Well, in practice, it's a journey. First of all, I mean, you need to, I will kind of like insist on that aspect. So you cannot start branding activities if your performance engine is not at the best practice. So what I mean with that is like all the platform, all the data, measurement, analysis have to be rock solid. That's the first point. If the engine is correct, then you can start to introduce branding. If you haven't covered that aspect, then you need to fix that part. And then you will start to trial and isolate market, a region, or a specific category. And that's the only way that you will be able to keep the stability of whatever you have on your engine that works and perform, and then add on an extra layers. And then you have to leave it enough few weeks, few months, if possible. That's the best. So then you can see and compare with the other market and the other part of the marketing activities, what you see as a difference. And then you need to repeat and try something new. So it's not only one channel, it's trial and error and grow.
I like that. So if your performance is not in order, you can start working on branding, and also there's an element of testing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will not recommend it for sure. because as CMO, we always have that constraint of the performance part of it to, the reporting, the P&L part of it. And of course, that it's very important. You cannot just go from one side to another without any, red thread into it and the why you're doing this.
And we'll come back to that, the P&L and all of that part as well. But I'm curious, Doug, you talk to a lot of clients every day, and they're from e-com, B2B, B2C, so different industries. How do they think when it comes to brand and performance? Is it very similar to what Cedric just said, or do you think is a little bit of a different mindset?
I can recognize a lot of what Cedric is sharing, and I think there's a lot of brands that have all of the right tools and the right frameworks to go ahead and replicate the strategy from Ellos or any other successful e-com, which is, nail your performance, make sure that your net or the web that you're throwing out is able to catch all of this demand that you're hoping to go generate, and then go do. Don't do it with the assumption that it's going to fail and that you're going to turn it off and turn your back on branding a month from now. Do it with the assumption that you'll learn something and that you'll do it again and again and again. I think a lot of brands, if they sat down on a strategy day, they would draw up that process as the ideal process. What I think happens to many clients of ours and brands in general is that it becomes a lot more of a tactic than a strategy, which also means that it becomes something that you do when a need arises rather than because it belongs in your media mix always. That's what we try to work with, and that's what we try to reverse a little bit. So what we see happening, especially in companies that might be struggling or where performance might be a little bit off from whatever target is set at the time, is that investments are cut. And what investments are cut first? That might be the branding initiatives that they started on the strategy day 3 weeks ago. And you're like, well, great. Okay, I see you want to save money. Branding is costly in the sense that we haven't seen the results yet. However, the most costly thing we can do is not letting it pay us back. So just taking the bill and not getting the goods. And I think that's the
common mistake.
Yeah, thanks. Because it is really nothing else. It is just an unfortunate mistake, and one that I don't think at the bottom of their hearts any CMO or CFO making this decision wants to do this, but it becomes the easy option and it becomes the cost-saving, quick decision. Oh, well, that branding project, it's also going to be a need in 6 months. Maybe we can afford it then. So I think it really boils down to the issue that branding for brands that are not fully aligned with what it can do for them and how it builds their success over time, branding becomes a cost and branding becomes an optional cost, which I think that's the core of the mistake.
Correct. Absolutely. Completely agree.
Why is reassuring? Because I feel in B2B is very much the same. When you say the word brand, is usually the CFO or the CEO are like, that's not going to happen. And it's exactly the same dynamic, really. One important element is why it's so difficult to sell brand internally. And I think, well, for B2B, definitely there's a lack of, maybe measurement or that framework. You guys in B2C are always the wiser, and we are kind of trying to keep up with you. But what do you think makes it so difficult to sell brand internally? Cedric, what's your take?
E-commerce is like 25, 30 years max. It was an explosion in terms of device, technology, accessibility to information and so on that just kept growing. And at the same time, you have the macroeconomics that really facilitate the consummations and everything was boiling. Performance became naturally a legacy to any e-commerce. And branding was almost never a point. It was all the other brands that are traditional brands that were keeping the branding part. And why it's so difficult is because naturally, if you come from that legacy of heavy performance part, where before it was not possible to measure the impact. And thanks to all those platforms, the data was like the bread and butter and the golden rules for measurement and pushing more investment, because then everybody could read it. Now, what is happening is basically that the market is shrinking. Not everybody have the same power of consummation. And it means that, you have more players for a smaller amount of consumer. So what makes you so different from an e-commerce point of view when you have a performance that is going well is you will reach a plateau. And then it will become a very hard equation. If you don't react quick enough or fast enough in that decision, you will ask marketings to actually continue that growth and at the desired KPI, cost of sales. And it will not happen. Because if you don't create that branding part with all the different obstacles that is coming from regulation point of view in EU, etc., especially for fashion, where you will need to charge more for the same garments, it will be impossible to get this if you don't introduce the branding at the right level, at the right time.
If I can challenge you a little bit, is it easy to stick to when things are boiling then? Or, let's say you come in last month, numbers weren't where you wanted them to be. Does that conversation linger?
I don't think you should wait for that. That's the thing. That's what I mean. It's like, well, of course, it depends from players to player where you are in that situation. But for us, we worked a lot on the platform, on the data, on the algorithm, on AI, on the models. And we have something that is strong. And it's now that you can do it. Because if you wait, then, of course, that question will become more and more difficult and tricky to get the whole team and the maturity across teams to get there. So you need to dare to take those risks before it happens. And then you don't have to wait. That's why I'm talking often about securing the performance engine to have that stability, because it allows you to play and move the money around and try to start to test the branding part activities. And that's what you need to do. Because if you wait, you have that plateau, you will not get necessarily that growth because there are so many players, and then you will have your cost of sales goes up with a growth that will be flat or negative. And this is where people will be, no, we cannot invest in branding. So you need to do that before it happens.
Yeah. So while all things are good and everyone's high-fiving at the office,
yes,
that's when you introduce the brand.
Correct. And then you need to build those evidence time after time, because as you say, Stefania earlier, why is it an obstacle? It's because of measurement. It's very difficult. I mean, you could have tooling like MMM and brand tracker, etc. Still, it will not resonate as a revenue strict evidence. You have the messy middle in the middle.
Yeah.
So that's why it becomes tricky.
Yeah, and connected to this, I think when we started talking about this topic, you said that in your organization you have the possibility to test and to move around budget, but there are other organizations where CMOs are having a very difficult time understanding how they can communicate the value of brand internally, especially as you said, sometimes it's not translating into revenues right away. If you were to give suggestions and tips to CMOs who are trying to explain the value of brand to their CFOs and CEOs, what would you say? What do you think they should do?
Yeah, but I will answer this by a question. Why should you go to a CFO and ask a permission? You're responsible. The CFO is not looking at every buy and commitment campaign you're doing and your full strategy on how you buy all those campaigns and how you steer those platforms. So basically, since you're sitting on that bag of money, you have the possibility, as long as, again, your performance engine is set, so you can really achieve the growth in terms of top line, but you also achieve and continue to achieve the performance on your cost of sales. So, and nobody will come to you and say, well, why did you do those tests? Why are you trying this? Because you are reaching both of the targets. And it's more on the question to allocate that money differently and do those tests. What you need to do is to build evidence over time. And then when you can come from evidence to evidence and evidence, then this is where you might tweak the cost of sales budget for next year and asking a small percentage that will be slightly higher because you have evidence that it really helped to create demand and fuel the performance engine.
I think that's an interesting take. That's one that, first of all, it's going to be liberating, hopefully, to CMOs or other budget owners to hear that. But it sounds like people have a lot of groundwork to do before they can get to that state. So if we're saying that branding efforts and investments and tests in that space rely on rock solid performance, then I think a lot of brands will go back to thinking, how can I make my lower funnel efforts more stable? So are we then also saying that those brands shouldn't invest in branding before they are fully set?
Well, I will have like a generic answer in terms of it's definitely part of the marketing stack that works well. And that's maybe the part that you should start to move first. Yeah. Because it can't be that nothing is working good enough. Now I'm talking about the full stability. But for sure, when you zoom in terms of the investment and the campaign you're running, for sure, some of them are working really well. And that's probably the angle that gives you the direction of whether it's a category, it's a market, or it's something else. And then where you can start to think differently. But to come back to your questions, Stefania, is like, it's as if you're asking the CFO to solve the CMO's, problems. You're going to spend more money, but you're not going to give me evidence. But if you do the opposite of building case one after another, then it's much easier for CFO and CEOs to see the impact. And then you can really take like a bigger step in that case. But it's not that you will make a huge change from 1% to a much higher percentage. It's not going to happen like this. It's going to happen over time. We're still e-commerce. We're focusing on performance. We're focusing on that growth element, acquiring new clients and so on. And if people start to think like, I should knock at the door at the CFO to get more millions, no, it's not going to happen.
Well, I really like, Cedric, what you said. CMOs should be a bit more risk takers, a bit more bold, and often we're not for many different reasons. What do you think is a way? How could CMOs be a bit more bold without losing their jobs in today's environment, really?
Well, I think it's again the same point of discussion of like our job is to really secure that the performance and the growth is hitting the targets, but it's also, in a very moving and fast changing environment of technology platforms, and it keep repeating and changing. For this to be bold is to be a risk taker. I mean, why should you wait always being on your comfort zone where you have actually the power and the possibilities to innovate and embrace those technology and being faster in terms of like those changes? Again, in terms of branding, not long times ago, it was difficult to access to the measurement part. It was something that you cannot afford because it was too expensive. The same as buying media on a rich level was always via an agency, where today everything is accessible from any platform and you can use whatever measurement in order to see the impact. You can see things in front of you, you can act on it. So this is the reason why I say CMO should take more risk, because it is possible. You have that bag of money. It's up to you to change and steer it and see it in a different angle, as long as you reach your KPIs.
And I guess it won't be that risky if they have all the data to prove in real time. Risky in that sense would be relative. It would be risky if what they were doing before was not taking any chances, sticking to their same channels, not investing in branding because that seems like a cost more than a revenue opportunity. Then it would be risky.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting, the concept of risk, because with all the data that we have available now, I guess it's way more risky to not try than to try and fail and actually have data to back up your decisions. It could be going in a different direction, but is way more risky for us as CMOs, head of marketing, to not try. So we're definitely guilty of that. I was thinking, Dag, obviously not all companies are so advanced or so data-driven, and they have that well-oiled machine as you do have at the Ellos, Cedric. So in general, Dag, what do you see in the industry? What are the challenges that companies have at the moment to actually build that machine that can enable us to build performance and on top of that to build branding?
So I think what the industry is suffering from right now is almost sort of being over-taught in the bottom-up funnel approach and not really daring to see how to break through those roofs and come to the middle and top funnel. In other words, what I'm seeing brands that are doing well is that they are, to a much greater extent, rethinking some of those frames, whether it's their funnel stages, their reporting timelines, their way of calculating cost of sale, which things go in and out of that. Those are the ones that are actually breaking new ground and that are perhaps seeing better performance and that can allow themselves to take more risky bets than those that stick to all that they know and all that the industry has taught them for 20 years. I think the industry in many ways has built its own cage. We've drawn up a funnel. We've traditionally divided it into 3 sections, and now we're even sitting here saying fix your bottom section before you move up. However, what people need to do is rethink what fixing that means, and I think that's the new element here and what some of the successful players that we work with are able to do.
Right. And you mentioned some of the most successful brands that do this, they have some elements in common. So there are certain things that they all do or trying to do. And you mentioned, for example, like they have a more like longer term strategy, longer look back period. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
We mentioned before how branding is something that you do when you can afford it in some companies, which we believe is an unfortunate way of thinking about it. A way of getting around that is obviously to look at what does being able to afford something mean. And in performance marketing and in our business in general, that usually means having a solid margin or a solid cost of sale or ROAS or whatever you measure. Many brands, however, have not calibrated that number to the timeline that their business or their customer journey needs to generate the full number. So a short story here is one of our e-com brands, for example, they have 3 months returns. So how could you possibly understand what your ROAS is on a monthly basis if you have 2 more months during which products that you sold could come back and be a negative for you? That's a good example of a company that just looked at the calendar and then said, you know what? Maybe we should measure the full journey. We got a lot more correct cost of sale. We understood to a much greater extent which months were performing well or not, which also meant that we weren't as hindered by a past bad performing month when making decisions about branding in a new one. The example here would be, let's say we have a sale in June. That sale, we're selling at discount. That already hits the top line. On top of that, a few of those products are sent back during July and August. We come back in August and we say we want to do branding. Looking at that number, it's very important to understand that it was June sales that were performing badly and they were being returned. It wasn't July and it wasn't August. In other words, there's nothing indicating that we shouldn't go ahead with this initiative. In the old way of measuring, we would have gotten a bad month in June because of the lower top line, plus a bad month in July and August because we were taking back a lot of returns. So continuously being punished by our past, and that was like a cage. So just looking at the calendar and calibrating that to the customer journey really removed the shackles of this particular company and allowed them to invest in a lot more interesting and brand building initiatives that helped their lower funnel performance as well.
Okay, my last question is about a little bit about what's happening nowadays in the world and how CMOs or head of marketing should act and what they should think about when they think about their current investment in branding and performance. And we all know that when there are economic uncertainty, what happens often is that CMOs or head of marketing decide to disinvest in brand. And often that's not the best decision. How do you think, Cedric, CMOs and head of marketing or companies in general in e-com should go about period of turbulence such as the one we are in at the moment?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And for this, as you said, it's often the one that we cut first. And of course, that will be a bad idea because it's actually an opportunity. What will be the big trend of many players is to cut their investment in awareness and branding. And if you do the opposite and hold tight with your decision and at a level where you can afford it, for sure, then for sure you should keep it. It's whatever layers you add and you can sense already directly or indirectly the impact, you should keep it and add layers one after another. But again, it's a transition part. You have to adapt, reduce, but you should keep for sure.
And Dag, what do you think? I guess that's conversations that we're having at the moment with many of our clients. What do you recommend to do?
Understandably, a lot of clients and companies that we talk to are very frustrated with things that are going on, and they would like to take action because it feels like action should be taken. However, we tend to recommend erring on the side of caution, not in the sense of pulling back investment, but in the sense of ruining your entire setup by reacting too quickly. In other words, we're very much in agreement with what Cedric says. If you can afford it, as in if you've built those business cases over time, if you know you have a rock solid performance engine at the bottom and that this branding activity or upper funnel activity that you're doing is feeding that engine, there's absolutely no reason, business or political or any other reason, not to keep doing that. However, that's going to seem like the passive option compared to making a big, bold decision and saying we're cutting X or we're not shipping to Y country. That's where we will recommend understanding your data and the impact first so that we can properly assess the expected outcome of those cuts. There might be needs for cuts or readjustments, and that's important to always be open to doing, but we wouldn't want to recommend anyone to cut or change or move their budgets if we don't know why. if it's just about the news, just about feeling uncertain, but we don't have numbers to prove it, we don't have any indications from customers leaving the business, then, like Cedric said, I think it's more of an opportunity to stay cool and see what happens.
You need to look at your data first and actually understand what's the impact, because not all companies will react in the same way, and this situation won't affect all companies in the same way. So look at your data and then decide what to do. It was really, really interesting chat. I learned a lot. I'm a B2B marketer, so I'm trying to learn as much as I can about B2C and e-com as well. So thank you so much, Dag and Cedric, for taking the time today. And yeah, thank you again.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Connecting the Dots, a podcast by Precis. Precis is a global marketing agency helping brands make smarter decisions across data, media, tech, and creative. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. And if you want more insights from this episode, including an exclusive takeover by our guest, go to precis.com and subscribe to Connecting the Dots, the newsletter.